All right, hello everybody. My name is Sunil, and this is my shout out to the original Motorola Droid that really made Android what it is today. Hello, Moto. So today I'd like to talk about a couple of Android architecture recipes that I've been cooking up. But before that, a little bit about the chef. Been an Android kitchen hand for 2 years, an Android chef for 5 years. I've worked in various kitchens and burnt many cookies many times, but I'm still cooking. I also work at Billy, which is lots of fun because it has a startup feel without the startup worries. And we're always looking for talent, so if you're interested, come talk to us. But before we dive in, why talk about architecture? Well, from the beginning, Google hasn't really had any strong opinions about how to architect your app or various architecture patterns. But recently, they've come out with Android architecture components. And has anyone here used Android architecture components? Awesome, a lot of people. And look, whilst they're quite simple to use, they may not be ideal for all situations. So, what is a good architecture? How do we know what architecture is best for you? Well, the key components for a good architecture is testability, so how testable is the architecture or the code base, reusability, which is the ability to reuse components across the app, maintainability, which means you shouldn't have to rewrite the whole app after working on it for some time, and extensibility, which is accounting for future growth. So here I'm going to list a couple of alternatives to Android architecture components and some recipes for architecture that might be useful for your project. First up, we have MVVM. Has anyone heard of this before? Good? Okay, good, because same people who used architecture components. Good. So MVVM is model, view, view model. Basically, it contains a model, a view, and a view model, which is the third party. And this is where the view model from Android architecture components comes from. So it follows a philosophy where the view is a visual representation of the view model, and the view actually has a reference to the view model, usually by data binding. Data binding is a pretty cool library, and the good thing about MVVM is it works really well with data binding. The problems I've had with MVVM is that usually I end up with huge view models, like huge classes, and it's inevitable that some logic will be present in the view. Has anyone ended up with huge view model classes after using Android architecture components? So we're both writing them wrong. Okay, great. So that's MVVM. MVP was pretty much the status quo before MVVM came onto the scene. And for MVP, you'll need a model, a view, and a presenter. And unlike MVVM, here the presenter contains the view and pushes updates to it. So usually the presenter is an interface to the view so that you can test it. And the good thing about it is it's very testable. With MVP, you can test almost everything. What's not so great about it is it's not super reusable or extensible, and you can still end up with quite a bit of code in the view. So in your fragments and activities, they could get quite large still. MVI is a little bit newer, and here you have a model, a view, an intent system, and a renderer. So this is a React-like architecture. So here all the components talk to each other via events or intents, and usually using something like RxJava or EventBus or other libraries that are similar. And it's a great way to decouple things because you're only using events and intents to talk to other people. But it's also difficult to debug, so you may not know how to follow your stack trace if something goes wrong. VIPRE is my favorite name. I love it. The architecture not so great, but the name is wonderful. So it is somewhat of an extension to MVP, but here we add two more things: an interactor which processes logic, and then it pushes that to the presenter, and we also add a router. So the router basically is a centralized navigation area where you can start your activities, fragments or dialogues. And with VIPRE, the good thing about it is you have a nice segregation of code. So you have more components. So that means by default your classes are probably going to be a little bit smaller because you're splitting it out. But the bad thing is that it can get complicated because there are that many more components to deal with. Finally, MVPI, which is my favorite architecture. This is what Netflix uses in their Android apps, so it's got to be good. It's currently my favorite architecture because it's very componentized. And what that means is you have a number of components, and each component inflates its own view and listens to and publishes events via an event bus. So your app is really just a bunch of components that are set out in a linear layout or a simple a relative layout or constraint layout. And this makes it really testable, reusable, maintainable, and extensible. So I give it full marks. Now, I haven't used this architecture before, but I will, and I hopefully it'll work out for me. So let's see how that goes. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about clean architecture. So has anyone heard of clean architecture before? Good, some have, yes. So clean architecture can be used with any of the previous architecture patterns that I've been talking about. And basically all it is separating your concerns by creating layers in your architecture. So you may have a presentation layer, a repository layer, a data layer, and each layer can be tested separately. The good thing about it is you can chuck new layers, chuck in new libraries, switch them up, and you can still keep your app in a relatively usable condition. So it's quite flexible. And so clean architecture is something that I use regardless of which of the above architectures I use in my apps. Finally, to wrap it up, the ultimate goal of good architecture is to minimize the lifetime cost of the system and to maximize the programmer productivity. So when you think about it in those simple ways, you can really mix and match the various architectures that you've seen up here according to your own taste. Now, a tasty architecture is testable, reusable, maintainable, and extensible. That's all I have for now. Thank you.